Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. And if you're looking to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today we're doing chapter 10 of Breaking Step. I'm fine, Don muttered under his breath as Tibs looked over the shallow cut along his arm. It's not like you can do anything about it, so stop trying to be a hero. The sorcerer's dark robe only had the base armor enchantments to put on the sorcerer's... On the what? On the sorcerer's handed out as loot. Yeah, on the robes. He handed out as loot. It hadn't proved effective against the golem person using void essence to blink from place to place, dodging attack until she was... Oh, okay, I know what... Okay, until they were close enough. That's what I was going for. To cut Don. It had put them within reach of the sorcerer, so he'd grabbed hold and pushed corruption into them. Ugh. You know what? No. They are people, so they will look gendered, and Tibs reflexively uses that, unless it's specific. And they're creatures. He'll be more careful with people, like Zakaria, but with creatures until she was close enough to cut Dawn. It had put her within reach of the sorcerer, and he grabbed hold and pushed corruption in. She'd blinked away until she was done melting. We look after each other on this team, Tibbs replied, even if it's the asshole who's hurt. When Don didn't snap a protest, Tib looked up from the arm. The sorcerer was looking away. Tell me you have more bandages, Mez asked Kumdar, who handed him a roll of linen. The archer glanced in Tibbs and Don's direction as he wrapped his hand. I hate that I forgot to bring some. Traveling as I did, the cleric said, I have discovered that bandages are something one never has too many of. He handed the roll to Tibbs, who used it on the long cut. He made a splint, with his essence at the same time to speed up the healing. Are you really a cleric? Don asked. I do not care what you believe. Kumdar replied flatly, then walked away. I wasn't. The sorcerer called, then closed his mouth. Is he asked Tibbs. What do you care? Don't you care that he might be lying to you and your team about what he is? What he is? We're all lying about something, Tibbs replied. I'm not. The words lit up, but Tibbs already knew Don was a liar, so he didn't call him out on it. The only thing I care about is that Kumdar has our back, and he does. Secured the bandages and re-rolled the rest of the linen. Don closed his mouth and looked away. Tibbs was mildly curious as to what he'd intended to say, because there had been no light. The last line of the boar's crest slid into place, completing the design, and the door raised up, even revealing the uneven floor of the room. Don whispered a curse. Wait here while I make sure the pattern is the same, Tibbs instructed before stepping in. Pattern? Don asked. There's an order to which column causes the others to move, Mez said as the one Tibbs stepped on rose and others reacted. I never noticed that, Don replied, sounding odd. Did you even let your rogue try to work it out? Jekyll asked derisively. Jekyll, that's not helping, Mez replied. I agree with Mez. Kumdar cut Jekyll off as Tibbs looked the landscape over. He leaped to the next column and he crouched as it went up again, ready to jump if it. Cursor, there you are. If It didn't stop when he expected it to. Didn't you walk away from him asking you a question? The fighter demanded. It stopped with barely enough room for Tibs to stand. The other columns also looked what he expected. Yes, so the situation would not become aggravated. Tibbs climbed down, then making sure Don was still distracted by the conversation, jumped. He leaped again on an air disc to reach his target, which moved down as he landed on it. None of us gain anything by fighting and arguing. We know this. I believe your early day. No, you know this. You know this. I believe your early days here were filled with the result of teams who could not work together during their runs. Don's presence meant he'd have to rethink his usual path, since many of those jumps required a disc to complete. That we agree with the decision or not, Don is part of our team. We must put our conflict aside while inside the dungeon, lest we not survive the run. Another leap. I didn't expect you to just let him be intolerant of you, Jekyll said. I'm not, Don started. I have lived with intolerance directed at me my entire life. The cleric cut him up. Cut him off. Up. Yeah, no. His voice still neutral. The columns stopped moving, again matching his expectations. It is a large part of the reason behind becoming who I am. I no longer care how people feel about what I am. I find it easier to ignore them instead of engaging and wasting time explaining something they have no interest in understanding. The next column, Tibbs landed on, lowered almost to the floor, his view of most of the floor was hidden by the higher ones. But that too was as he'd expected, as he anticipated. I'm not intolerant, Don whispered in the silence. Tibbs jumped onto the side of a column and hurried up it so he could see the others move. Everything matched, and those closest to the entrance were at a height he knew his team could handle, except, Don, how are you at jumping? Don't worry about me, the sorcerer replied, then added in bright words, I'm going to be fine. Jekyll snorted. Don, Miss said softly, he needs to know so he can point you to the columns you'll be able to reach. I misjudged my capabilities during our first time through this room, Comdar said. Recovering from that improper leap proved difficult. Don gave the clerk a suspicious look. I'm not great at jumping. Jekyll closed his mouth from being glared at by Mez. Tibbs looked over the options, evaluating what not great might mean, then assigned the columns to his team to get on. Weight wasn't relevant, so all that matters was that the correct ones were occupied for the floor to rearrange itself as Tibbs needed. How did your team get through this room? Jekyll asked when they were roughly halfway through. Don't move from your platforms, Tibbs said, studying the wall of columns still blocking their way. I need to test the path. He jumped to another column. Suthereth rushed it, the sorcerer said. She ran through, jumping from one column to the other before the center path closed. Suthereth did have a love of jumping and running, Comdar said. The landscape shifted, and Tibbs glanced back to his team. Mez lay down as his column rose, but it stopped before coming close to the ceiling. The others, even Dawn, didn't seem worried about how theirs moved. You knew her? Dawn asked, surprised. She and I shared interests. I had to melt a column that rose in her path the first time, Dawn said, and Tibbs stopped, about to jump and turn. You melted a column? With corruption? He looked up. Dawn is powerful, Stowe said. It only worked that time. I thought I'd just melt a path through the next run, but the dungeon made them resistant. I learned fast, Stowe said proudly. Tibbs focused on Dawn. His essence was dense, its match Jekyll in that way, but that couldn't be all there was to it. Tibbs had used up most of his fire reserve before the rattling camp's wall were damaged, and Stowe hadn't woven protection against fire into them the way he had for corruption. Skill had to have played a part. Alistair showed Tibbs how skill could defeat brute force, and what and what was an indiscriminate weaving through the walls as protection than a brute force application of essence. Don must have used skill to melt the columns, woven or etched the essence in a way that made it stronger than what Stowe had done. Only they weren't supposed to learn about weaves until after Lambda, and Don couldn't be so far in his studies of etching he could overcome Stowe. Could he? Was he forgetting? Wasn't he forgetting that sorcerers read books? Each one Tibbs had met was a runner because they'd been caught stealing books. But could Don have read enough to progress beyond what he was taught? Tibbs would have to think of a way to get the sorcerer to tell him about what he'd read so he could figure out how to apply that to his essence. He put that out of his mind, made it yet another thing on his list, and focused on working out the proper path to open the wall of columns and cross to the other side. There, a push of the lever brought the columns down and turned them off so his team could walk to him, and they continued on. Tibbs glanced at the shield at the top of the intersection. Reaching the dragon crest had taken longer than he'd planned. Since he couldn't ask, he couldn't know if the information he'd been that the information that had been accumulated by the previous teams had been wrong, or if Genny had changed the triggers leading to the opening of the path. Whatever the reason, what had been written down had gotten them lost and cost them time. How long do we have? Jekyll asked. Tip shrugged. The line on the shield was low enough they didn't have much time left, but beyond that, he had no idea. A candle's worth at most, Don said, studying the shield. Are you sure? Jekyll asked. Yes. Didn't you bring one and work out how much of the line one took to burn completely? We worked out that when it's out, the next team's coming in, Jekyll said with a roll of the eyes. But unlike you, candles aren't something we waste coins on. Don was the one rolling his eyes now. Being able to know how long you have isn't a waste, he motioned to the jumbled crest. Is one candle enough time to solve that lock? Jekyll narrowed his eyes at the tone, and Don looked away. Tibbs? The fighter asked. I don't know yet. He hadn't studied the puzzle. The idea was to reform the dragon, but it wasn't like the previous two. He also didn't know how long a candle took to burn. He knew that all the candles the merchants on the row sold were the same and took the same amount of time to burn. Garen had mentioned it at some point, but Tibbs only used them for light if he felt the need to read in his room. The inn had the lanterns, and if he needed to know the time, he had the sun, Clara, and Taurus in the sky for that. He glanced at the puzzle. A glance at the puzzle told him this wouldn't be about sliding the tiles. Each tile had a dot at the corners that acted as a pivot point for the four that touched the dot. They resisted so that they didn't continue turning if you let go, and when they were aligned with the others, there was a subtle click, telling him that whatever else was expected, that was their neutral position. From there, he could pick a different dot and turn those tiles around. There was essence throughout the crust, but from the way the edges of the tile passed through each other as he turned them on a pivot, he figured that was what it was for and not part of what he needed to overcome. He turned tiles until he had a line, then looked at the time shield. Half of what had been left was gone. I can't finish this in time, he admitted. It's going to get harder as more pieces are in their right place until I work out the system. He looked at the crest. 9 tiles up and across. I don't know how long that's going to take me to work out. Then we come here first on the next run, Don said. No, Jekyll glared at the sorcerer. We do the other 2, then we come here. Jekyll, Miss said, Don's making sense. Loot's not so important. It's not about the loot. Tib joined the other in staring at the fighter, who sighed. It's not just about the loot, but yes, in part that. It's in part that. And no, it's not me being stupid. One of the reasons for the runs is to get the loot. The coins from the fights and the cash Tibbs finds on the way are nothing like what the rooms gives us. Especially now that we can take everything in the chest instead of one item per room. With the new guard leader not liking Tibbs, there's no telling if the merchants will be forced to stop paying for the protection Tibbs gives them, and Tibbs is not going to stop helping them, or the Omegas when they get here. That takes coins. Unless one of you knows something I don't, we aren't in a hurry to clear the floor. So we take as long as it needs to work out this floor after we clear the previous one. No, this door after we clear the previous rooms. Jekyll looked at them, and Don looked back suspiciously, as if he had trouble believing the fighter had thought of that himself. Now, we head back. If we're lucky, the dungeon will throw more golem people and gnolls our way. I still want to hit stuff. I can make that happen, Stowe said. Is it only I who consider it odd that Jekyll has stated he is not in a hurry to reach the boss room? Commodore asked. Maybe Khrushchev replaced the leader with a more sensible one. Jekyll replied. No, Tibbs said, following Jekyll. He just threatened to withhold damn time. If one of us tells him Jekyll's been stupid. Not you, Don. He doesn't care what you think. And that concludes Chapter 10 of Breaking Step. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next one's going to be up, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story, it is available for free on Royal Road. And if you're looking to read ahead of that, as well as support me, my Patreon is about 20 chapters ahead. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. The links are in the note. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.